So thank you very much. First, thank you very much for the invitation. As Francesco said, I'm the only one who made it to PSE. And I was honored yesterday being the only attendant to the conference dinner. So it was just Axel and Francesco anyway. Well, this is a paper with Chiara Felli, who is a student at Lewis and spent a lot of time in EIEF, and Lian Shi, who is an assistant professor in EIEF. So, no, as Tobias says, we don't have a paper yet. Okay, so Tobias he didn't found the paper because it doesn't exist. This is the very first time that we present this paper, so it's very preliminary, so all comments are very welcome. So what are we after? So we know that there is it's a widespread belief that governments like to borrow and they over-accumulate debt, and that creates a problem. So some arguments for this, the standard frictions to generate this are in general hyperbolic discounting. You can put it exogenously, or you may think like more endogenously, these are arising from some political economic constraints. In general, given to these frictions, this gives rise to the need to impose fiscal rules to ameliorate the potential bad consequences of these debt decisions, right? There is a literature about this, and it's the literature of commitment versus flexibility. I don't know if you know it, but you're gonna see it very clear because I'm gonna go through it through my presentation. The problem, one of the problems with this literature, I mean, it's a beautiful literature. That's why we're writing a paper in this venue. Is that well, they don't consider default risk or even the possibility of default by the agents, and as a result, they only have prescriptions for spending of deficit limits. But if you go to real life, you see what happens in general. There are not only deficit and spending limits, there's also some debt limits or condition or rules that are conditional on debt also. So our question in this sense is, so what kind of rules will be efficient or we will have to use to deal with this inefficient debt accumulation when the government can default? Okay, so what we try to ask is, you know, the debt limits that the previous literature have found are still true, or if so, do we need to impose additional rules, like suppose default rules, when you can default and when you cannot default, or debt limits and stuff like that, and also how these deficit limits and potential debt limits interact. Okay. To be more clear, let me tell you what we do. So we write a model that we think is more suitable for quantitative analysis. We are not going to do that today, but that is the ultimate goal. And we incorporate these standard frictions that I told you before and the default choice. So what do? We consider an economy with in continuous time with taste shocks. And so you can think about agents that they have some types, they like to consume more or less, and suddenly they change their type. But then these types are private information. They are not observable for a regulator or for a planner or for nobody else. And in addition, we're going to give you a model where the governments are present bias. And they're going to be present bias. They're going to show you that it's going to encompass the two frictions that I told you before. This is like hyperbolic discounting in one way, or the political economy in the other extreme. Okay. So here the idea in this literature, these two frictions, that the private information in the taste shocks and the present bias, in general leads to this trade-off between insurance, that you want to insure the different types when they have different needs. But given that they are present bias, they tend to lie and to ask for more money. And how do you find the optimal mechanism to implement the best possible insurance, right? So what we do here is in this paper, and especially for this talk today, so before going to the quantitative analysis, we try to characterize theoretically what are the optimal allocations, right? So basically what we do is to extend and modify previous results on spending rules to this particular environment, and we analyze what rules will be optimal when there is default. And as far as I know, I haven't seen it in this context, this kind of analysis, right? So in short, what are we going to find? First, as I said, this is a progress report. So we had a big case that we're still missing, and some things may.
Am I the only one who can't hear sound though?
Facundo, I think we can't hear you.
Facundo, can you hear me? Facundo, can you hear me? Okay. Does everybody hear me?
I can hear you, but I can't hear Facundo.
Okay.
So maybe you can wave at him if we speak and wave at him.
Okay, now it should be good. Yeah.
Now you hear something?
Yes.
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 Now we can hear.
Okay, so I had a problem. So when you didn't hear anything at all
No, just for a last minute or so.
for this? Okay, so I think my Zoom collapsed. So you're seeing my
Facundo, it might help if you were speaking closer to the speaker because your voice is very vague.
Wait, can you hear me better now?
A little bit.
Oh, okay, so I don't know what it's oh, I see. So now you can hear me?
Yes.
Much better.
Okay,
Yes,
so
good job.
I can tell you what happened. So it's
We
not
lost-
the earphones are not working in my computer, and then the microphone is working with another device. So it's hard to tell. Okay, sorry. So can somebody tell me? So you heard?
We lost you after the first bullet on what do we find.
Okay, so let me continue with this. So so as I said, this is a progress report. So there are some things that may change, but we think that the results, we still have very nice results. So one thing that we're going to find is like the spending rules or the deficit limits are going to be similar in shape to what the literature has found before, but they're going to be debt dependent. So they're going to move with the debt. And the default, in particular, the default risk is going to interact with the spending rule, in the sense that you want to decrease the amount of discretion that you allow to the government when the debt is accumulating and increasing the default risk.
Can I ask something actually?
Yes.
So what is the difference between the spending rule and the optimal spending allocation? I mean, do you make a difference or not?
No, okay. So what I mean, the optimal spending rule is it's going to be clear before, but this is basically the same. The optimal allocation implies an optimal spending rule.
Okay, just a way to write the optimal allocation.
Exactly.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So, and then another thing we're going to find, and when we think about optimal default rules, obviously there's going to be the limits, and there is going to be restriction on default. And there are many possibilities, and that's why we don't have the full characterization yet. But I can anticipate, and I'm going to show you these examples. And in some cases, you want to ban default. You say, look, if you have not enough debt, nobody's allowed to default. And for other level of debts, you're going to say to the government, you have to default. If you have enough debt, even if you don't want to, you're going to be forced to default. Okay, so and also under some conditions, a tight borrowing limit is gonna rise, in the sense that there is gonna be no default in equilibrium. So you have debt, you can accumulate debt up to a certain limit, and after that you cannot pass it. If for some reason you are born in the default side, you have to default. Okay? And when you have the spending bias not too big, there are gonna be some areas of debt under which you say you cannot default. And I'm gonna give you these examples in detail. This is just an anticipation that everything can happen. Okay? So related to the literature, I'm gonna be quickly because I spent some time with my audio problem. So there is a literature on commitment versus flexibility. Basically, what they do is exogenous prices. There is no default, stuff like that. There is a variation in Halak and Yared. They have a recent paper where they consider in that literature when the prices are endogenous. This is different because they have a market clearing condition. Here is default risk, so there are going to be some differences. Well, there is a rich literature in default. Christina is one of the main contributors in here. But given that we are doing like continuous time, we follow this approach of Bernstein. It's a new paper. And regarding dead rules or default rules, I don't think there are many papers in the kind of environment that we're doing. Chiara is actually working in numerical estimations of the effects of some rules. And there is a new paper that we found out not long ago about with Alfaro and Kansuk, but it's a particular case. I'm going to try to describe it later what is the difference. Okay, so when I'm going to go now, I'm going to explain you the model, how the environment is, what is the main friction. Then I'm going to put the default decision. I'm going to go to the principal agent and some characterizations. Okay, so let me show you the model, and I hope this clarifies many things. So time is going to be continuous, goes forever. A is going to be assets. So think about negative A as debt. Tau are the revenues, and there is a government that has a spending G. So standard notation in here. Then there is a budget constraint. Basically, the change on debt of assets is equal to the flow of income minus the flow of consumption, or the flow of spending in the case that we have in mind. So the government has preferences for spending that is sort of a standard. You have a normal utility function that is increasing and concave in spending, and there is a taste shock. This theta shock. So you have a higher type, you want to consume more, you have a higher marginal utility, you have a low theta, you have a low marginal utility. But this type is not going to be fixed. Every instance with some arrival rate lambda, the government is going to change the type or is going to change the taste. Okay, and then every time that you change, you draw a new taste or a type that is IID. And it has a mean one. That is a normalization. Okay, and everyone is going to discount the future at the rate rho. This is standard. Nothing new at this. So what is new in here? So we are going to assume that while you are the government, while you keep your theta, you have your own type. You are in control. You are like, suppose you are the president. You are chosen to be in the executive, you keep that position, and then when the shock arrives, you change your type, but you also lose control of the environment. So this government, you value, you discount your allocations at the rate rho that I told you before, and you discount more the allocations of future governments. So when you have and that is given by this beta. That is less than 1. So basically think about a government that you say, look, I like the breaches, but if I do the breach, I like it better. And that is more or less the idea. So how does this look in the model? For the moment, suppose there is no default. Default is not even possible. It doesn't exist in the environment. And this W is the value function of a government that it has assets A and a type theta. Yeah, this is the standard. This is the standard AGB. Given that while you are in power, your theta is constant. There is no second order term. There is only a first order term. So you get the flow utility of your consumption, and then you have the value of change in the assets. This will be the change on the assets, and this is the value of the wealth for the agent. But then when the lambda shocks happens, you are reborn with another theta, and somebody else keeps the control. You discount that allocation at the rate beta. Okay, it's a factor beta. So given that you don't know when it changes, it's IID, you take the expected value of all the future guys that could be in power. Okay, and notice that here there is a W, and here there is a V, and the reason is because this V is like a continuation value. In the continuation value, when you think for all the future guys, you have this value, the flow is equal to the flow utility more or less the same as the agent with W, but the difference is that there is no beta. For you, all the guys, after you lose control, all the guys are discounting exactly the same. Okay? If you have any questions, tell me. And so what happens, and you evaluate this utility at the given, what you think is your expectation about the optimal choice of the future government.
Please, I wanted to know
Yes.
where's the, is there utility? So there's a utility of public spending, there's a utility of the assets.
No, this is utility of the public spending. This is the
Yes.
value function given your assets.
Okay, but where's the disutility of taxation?
There is no disutility of taxes. They are exogenous. We are not there yet.
So why not imposing 100%?
Because you don't choose the taxes, they're exogenous.
Ah, okay,
As you see, you maximize, you choose only your consumption.
okay.
Okay? So you have an exogenous stream of revenue. So we are not considering the endogeneity of taxes yet. Okay?
So
it
more
would be fair
government is
to say
always
that
better. Sorry, more government is always better. Well, it's less and less because there is a
No.
okay,
You have a
utility.
present, okay, so think about this. You have a present value of future resources, they are exogenous. And you have to allocate those resources optimally across time and contingent on the realization of the types. So this mechanism, this incentive is going to be present even if you have endogenous taxes. Okay? It doesn't change anything. Okay, so if you don't want to do your government infinity today because you don't have government tomorrow. The taxes are constant. Okay? Is that clear? Hello?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so what happens here, what is the nice things about this setup, this way to write the preferences is like that when lambda goes to infinity, this converges to the instantaneous gratification model of Harrison and Leibson. It's like thinking about hyperbolic discounting in continuous time. For any lambda that is between 0 and infinity, you can think about like these models of political economy of government debt as Alesina and Tavellini or Battaglini and Co. You can think about this lambda like the turnover probability of the government. So with the arrival rate lambda, you lose power and somebody else comes in there. Okay, and that is a neat thing about this model that in all these frictions that are in the literature in some way or the other. Okay, so as I said, okay.
But Facundo, no, I guess just a comment, and I guess Christoph has done work on political economy stuff and documented some of these transitions might depend on your actions, like this the amount of spending, default, and so on.
Yes. No, I completely agree. Yes, that is another step. Believe me, this is hard enough, and then we can do endogenous turnover. Yes. Okay. Okay, so where I am, I'm here. So now, this is when you have no default. And so when you're in the state of no default, this is exactly what happens. And you're going to keep accumulating, and you're going to move until somebody else takes you out of the power. So, but what happens, what we're including here with respect to other literature is that at any time the government can default. And then when the government default, we use the standard approach that there is exclusion for the financial markets, and there is a cause of default. So when you are defaulting, you lose a proportion kappa of your revenues. Kappa is less than 1, but you may regain access to the financial market with a rate fee. And then when you return, for the talk today, I'm going to tell you what happened when we change this. When you return, you return with 0 assets. And this is very important that is 0 or a positive number or another number. I'm gonna give you an example. But let me focus in the return with 0 assets. Okay. So what happens when you're in default? You defaulted. This is the value of default. Doesn't depend on assets because you defaulted, and you are excluded from the financial market. So there is no value of accumulating assets, and you consume exactly, you are in autarky, you consume all the revenues that you have, and you evaluate it at the rate theta as the other consumption. So with the arrival rate fee, you return to the market, and then you return with 0 assets. Okay, and this is an important thing because again, with probability lambda, you can change your type, and you discount also the changes of the future guys when they are in default. And this is going to be very important because if you think about this beta like discounting allocations that generates inefficient allocations, the discounting is in both sides. It's in the side of the default and the non-default. So when you are thinking about default thresholds, it's not clear the effect. It's not clear that you're going to default more or less than the optimal. Depends how the discounting is affected. Okay? And this is the continuation value function to evaluate the future governments. Okay? So if there were no government rules about default, what would happen is simply that the government will choose the maximum between the value of non-default and the value of default. This is basically following Arellano from Eaton and Gestovitz, and then in continuous time, this version is from Borstein 2020. Okay, any questions about this? No, okay. So the lenders, what are the lenders? We also follow the literature, everything is more or less standard. So there's a continuum of risk neutral lenders that face a risk-free interest rate, RF, we're gonna call it RF. So, and there is suppose delta, I'm gonna name it, is the default decision. In this case, delta, you're gonna see I have 2 deltas. One is the delta is like what is gonna happen in equilibrium, that it could be imposed by the planner. If the planner wouldn't impose any rules, it wouldn't affect the default decision. Obviously, this delta will be 1 if you default when the value of non-default is smaller than default, or you keep without defaulting when the inequality is reversed. And then there is a risky interest rate. This is also standard. It comes from the arbitrage and pricing, which is the interest rate that you have to pay on your debt is equal to the risk-free times the probability, the expected default at each instance. And notice this is multiplied by the jumping rate of the type. Here what happens is like you only default when there is a change of types. When you have your theta, you keep it with you. Everyone knows, the market sees your allocations, they know your theta, and they know what is your default threshold. So as long as you keep the accumulating, they're gonna keep lending you. When you reach a certain limit that they know that after that you default, they stop lending to you. There is like it generates sort of an endogenous borrowing limit for the agents. So here in this model with continuous time, you cannot generate default with continuous like a Brownian motions. You need to put jumps in some way. Okay. So later we're going to allow for the fiscal rule to set a default rule that is different than the default rule chosen by the agent. Okay. Any questions so far?
So I have a question about the debt rule of this government. Now you explained that default threshold. So do governments kind of like there is a change in theta, they borrow as, now given that this beta discounting, they borrow as much as they can, or they slowly grow into?
Depends on your theta. Depends on your theta. Suppose theta is 1 and the rho is equal to the interest rate. I mean, suppose the discount rate is equal to the interest rate, so you are an agent that neither accumulate or deaccumulate. Okay? If you have a high theta, you're gonna be deaccumulating slowly, you know, because you don't wanna eat everything. You may stay in power for a bit. You know, if you know that you're gonna be out of power tomorrow for sure, obviously you will eat as much as you can. But this doesn't happen for sure. So you keep deaccumulating. Okay? And on the other hand, if you have a very low theta, what you do is to decrease debt or accumulate assets. Basically, you can think about low theta like a very low discount rate. Okay?
So the theta equal to 1 guy doesn't accumulate debt despite discounting the future?
No, if the interest rate is equal to the interest rate. If rho is equal to RF. Okay, think about the interest rate equal to the discount rate. So in a standard model, deterministic model, so it's optimal for any agent not to change the level of debt. In this case, that's going to happen when there is no default risk and when theta is equal to 1. Okay? Every guy who has a theta bigger than 1, you may think that these models in which you have is a high discount factor, a low discount factor guy that they accumulate. And every guy who has a low theta, you can think like a guy who is very patient and is willing to accumulate.
And that's independent of lambda.
That is independent of lambda. Because as I said, every time that you change, you draw a new theta that is IID. Okay? It's in there. Okay? Does that clarify something?
Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah.
Slow. So what are we going to do? So we're going to put this in a principal agent framework. What do we do? So suppose there is a planner or a principal who cannot observe theta. Alternatively, you may think that this theta, even if they are observable, they are not contractable. So like you say, I know some parties like to spend more than the others, and I would like to constrain them, but that is not allowed because you cannot do a rule that is contingent on, the left party has a rule different than the right party. That will be unconstitutional or illegal. So any interpretation is fine with me. So what the plan is going to do is going to choose a contingent allocation, theta and A. Contingent allocation, I mean G, the spending and default rules. And it's not going to have any constraint on instruments. The only constraint is that the governments or the agents have to truthfully reveal their theta. It has to be truthful revelation of theta and equilibrium. So to be more concrete, so a planner chooses a contract, which is the spending G, and the default contingent on thetas and A, such that you maximize the present value of utility subject to incentive compatibility. That means that if you have a type theta, you don't want to pretend to be another theta tilde for all A and for all contracts that you consider, okay? It's important the plan is maximizing the ex-ante present value of utility. I'm going to show you why. And here is a thing, as you say, like this contract depends only on theta and A. This contract, dynamic contracts literature, sometimes there is a promised utility or history dependence. So here we can show that when there is no default, because the shocks IID, the contract is history independent. Okay? We still need to prove it for the economy with default, but in this case, you can think about that as an assumption, right?
Sorry, Facundo, just
Yes.
I'm about to read one question from Nuno Coimbra, Banque de France.
Yes.
Which I read is, will it still be true that default only happens after a change in theta if
Yes.
there were other shocks in the model that affect the intertemporal budget constraint of the government, like productivity shocks that affect the tax base? Yes.
Okay. So it doesn't matter the shock that you're introducing here. Defaults only happens when there is a jump on the state of the economy. Okay, so you can put a productivity shock. In fact, we are working in a model in which we separate the change of government of the theta shock, in which there is an event in which you can lose the power or change the productivity, right? The two things can happen. Or, you can change the productivity and stay in government. In that case, you will default when there is a sudden change in productivity, okay? And that's what I mean. Default only happens after a jump. If it's a continuous, if you think about Brownian motion that is moving slowly, that will never generate default. Okay, even if it's productivity, you can put it. Actually, we are planning to add in an extension of Brownian motion that is observable, but it wouldn't affect default. Okay.
Thanks.
So, what an implication of the value function? The planner, notice that the planner decides. The planner decides here the ex ante without knowing the theta. And this is standard, that's what the people do in this literature, and I think is the right thing to do. What happens in those models in which you don't have default is that the equilibrium converges to the first best when the friction disappears. So when beta goes to 1, in the sense that the current governments don't discount more the future governments, everything converges to an efficient equilibrium. And here, even when you have beta equal to 1, the equilibrium could be inefficient. And the reason is the planner, so if I wrote an equation here, suppose Suppose this is a default threshold that the planner would choose, or a government would choose. The government only thinks it's comparing, given a theta, is comparing the value of default, of non-default with the value of default. And this is standard rules that I showed you before. So basically, you don't care about other types, and you default whenever it's convenient for you. But this planner, when it's maximizing, is choosing the optimal rules, is considering that the default of one type in one particular state is affecting all the other types that could arise at the same level of debt. Okay, and then internalizes this price externality, and it tries to correct it also with the default threshold. Okay, and so just one thing to keep in mind, because that is a main difference with the previous literature. Okay, so given that, I'm gonna try to go quickly to this, but it's important, and this is sort of an extension of what happened in the other literature. So what are the incentive compatible allocations in here? And incentive compatible allocations are basically fiscal rules. And that is super interesting, and then you can do numericals just having this proposition. Basically what is an incentive compatible allocation is any spending rule, and here I separate them by the spending and default rules. Any spending rule must satisfy the first area if you have a theta that is sufficiently low. Okay, there is a threshold theta G that is think about like a bunching threshold, such that every theta that is below that, you have full discretion. Basically, this is the first order condition of the government. Okay? And any theta that is above that threshold, you are constrained. Basically, you are constrained to choose the same allocation as an upper bound theta. You say, look, every theta below 2 can do whatever they want, but any theta above 2 has to do exactly the same as the theta 2 guy will do. Okay, is that clear? This is an extension also. The same happens when you have the incentive compatible default rules. What you have is like there are 3 areas in which if the debt is too big, basically the planner may force you to default. If the debt is not too large, the planner may force you to not default at all. And for any level of debt that are in some intervals, the government can do whatever they want. They have full discretion to follow their optimality condition. Okay, so think about this like there are areas of discretion for spending, and there is an area of discretion for default. And then the planner is truncating the extremes. That is actually the characterization of the incentive compatible allocations. Okay? Any questions about this?
Yeah, so
yes.
Facundo, no, like this delta, like this rule about default. So it says delta theta A. I guess there is only this region where, I mean, the only dependence of theta is because there is this region where your threshold of default depends on your theta, but
exactly.
But the thresholds themselves do not depend on the theta.
Well, depends how you're right. Yes, correct. So basically, you can think about giving an A. You know what is the theta guy who will default, or you can think for each theta there is a threshold A. Yes, but you're right. Okay, so basically the planner tells you, look, if you're in this area, do whatever you want given the theta that you receive. That's it. Is that your question?
Yes, yes, thanks.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, why this happens? I don't know how is my time. So I can tell you quickly what happens in here. So you have, you can write this value function of the government, and now you can expand it. Suppose the principal says, okay, you have to follow this spending rule, theta A, but the agent can lie. I can pretend to be another X guy. Okay, and then this is a value function where you keep, this is a value function that depends on your own theta, but you can choose freely whatever X you want because the planner doesn't observe that. Quickly, you take some first order conditions and you get to this equation that you see here. That basically says either the first order condition, the discretion first order condition of the agent holds, or the rule is flat. Okay, so either the rule doesn't change with X, or the agent can do whatever they want. Intuitively here, what happens is there are no transfers. You think, you know, in many mechanisms that you have seen before, there's a planner that can do transfers across types. Here, the planner cannot do transfers because it's just a government, you're fixing the government, so you cannot transfer from one type to another type. You have one budget constraint today with non-state contingent assets, and there is no transfer. And because it shocks IID, you don't use the history to promise utility and distort the first. So in addition, because the spending has to be increasing in the type, basically this gives you immediately the part one of the proposition. That is, when your theta is small enough, you let the agents to do whatever they want, and when the theta is high, the default rule doesn't change. It's flat in X. It may be changing in A. Okay, and this is let me see. Okay, this is the same as Amador, Angeletos, and Amador, Bernin, and Angeletos, and Halak and Yaret. You're going to find similar characterizations of the incentive compatible spending rules. So what about the default rules? For the default rules, it's easier to understand. I'm going to show you just pictures, right? When you think about the thresholds, you are in the default literature, you always think about the thresholds. So I'm going to fix the spending rule. Okay, so suppose you fix it at the optimal, and suppose that the default decisions are monotone. Okay, this is going to be true when there is permanent exclusion. It's not necessarily true when there is a probability of return, and that is one of the parts where we are stuck. Okay, so suppose you fix that, you can define this threshold. I call it theta DA, such that the agent would like to default. So basically, this theta DA it means all the thetas that are above that threshold would like to default, all the governments, and all the thetas that are below, they would prefer not to default. At the same time, you can define the planner, what the planner will do if he knew exactly what is the theta. Here doesn't know, but what it would do if he knew exactly. So you can define exactly the same threshold, call it theta DP, such that the planner would like to make all the thetas bigger than this threshold to default, and all the guys that are below, we would like to tell them not to default. Okay, and so the optimal incentive compatible allocation is going to be determined by the relative position of these two threshold functions. And here I have an example. So you see here in the horizontal axis, you have assets, A, there is a 0, so I'm in the debt space. And here I have the types in the vertical axis. So suppose in this theta lower bar, this is the default threshold. That means that for assets, for debt that is larger than A lower bar A, everyone defaults. All the types, basically here there is default with probability 1. Here, suppose for all if the assets are above A upper bar A, nobody defaults. So you see all the guys, the default threshold is basically the upper bar, so nobody defaults. Okay, is that clear? This is standard from the default literature, and this is what the government would do. But suppose that the planner, and this is supposed because there are many cases, right? Suppose that the planner has instead would like to follow this red line. Okay, so the planner says, no, you know, when you are in this A upper bar A, I wouldn't like you to default. I will like force you to not default. So you can see immediately in this area between A upper bar P and A upper bar A that the planner can easily ban default in here. He says, look, I don't need to know your type. I know that if the lab level is not large enough, I don't want anyone to default. Okay, is that clear? That will be a default rule where you ban default in some areas. So do you stop in there? No, you don't stop in there. Because if you look, if you move, suppose you move a little bit to the left, in here, you can ban even further in the area. You say, well, you know, so I could ban default in here, and so I make epsilon mistakes. Because basically there is just an epsilon guy between these two lines, epsilon measure of types that it would be optimal to default them. But I better default, I ban default all whatsoever because I get all these guys that are below right, okay? And then you keep moving this line to the left. So to make it clear, what will be here the incentive compatible default rule? You ban default up to a certain A upper bar, okay? And then you allow discretion in this area. Okay, any questions about this? So you may wonder,
Yeah, so,
yes.
No, like this, the ban default, so like, I guess so if a government imposes this rule, I had to give you something, because like, so
No.
what is,
No,
so how do I ban default?
Suppose you say, exactly, this is about implementation. How do you implement this? Suppose you say the Congress gets together and says, look, we put a rule that it's not possible to default if the debt is not larger than 20% of GDP. And then if you want to overrule this rule, you need extreme supermajority. And there are many rules in the US government that are like that, for instance, and in many other countries. So basically, it's not the government would like to do it, but it's prevented by a law. The law says you are not allowed to default, never. You have to adjust the budget whenever the debt is below 20% of GDP. That will be an implementation. Okay, so you may think like a Maastricht also that says, look, you have to accumulate up to a certain level of debt. Obviously, the European countries don't satisfy that rule, but you can think that kind of rules. It's like, and here it would be non-default also. Is that okay? You are thinking about how do you implement this?
Yes.
Exactly. Yes. That would be an idea. That would be exactly a way to do it. You put a strong rule in the Congress and you ban default up to, and then you say, look, if you have debt above 20%, well, you can do it. You can go and you can default freely after that. Okay?
Thanks.
So this is one example in which these lines don't cross. You can have an example in which and I'm going to show you that everything is possible, in which this happens, they cross. Here, the red line is always above the other. It could be that the red line is crossing the blue line. So what do you do in that case? You ban default on the top. You allow discretion in the middle, and you allow discretion following the threshold of the government. And you force the government to default whenever the debt is super high in some dimension. So you say, look, if in some point you have 60% GDP debt or 100% GDP ratio of debt over GDP, you have to default. It doesn't matter if you don't want to. And I'm going to show you that sometimes incentives are that the planet wants to default and the government does not want to default. Okay? And so you can have another case. If I don't have time to explain this, but suppose that they cross in a different way, then there is no debt or default rules. Basically, you say to the government, I just put spending limits, deficit limits, and you let the government conditional on the optimal spending limit, you let the government to make their decisions about default or freely, without any constraint. Okay, all these possibilities are going to arise. And there is another more that I'm going to show you in a minute. And that's why we are still like, shaking, trying to characterize all these potential cases, but and I'm running out of time, so let me go to this. So now that is incentive compatible allocation.
No, sorry, but these different cases are gonna depend on what?
Oh, I'm gonna show you some examples. It's gonna depend on the return probability. It's gonna depend on the interest rate. It's gonna depend on the friction, on beta. Okay. The easiest case to characterize is Argentina, and I'm gonna show you in a second. Okay. So for Pablo and for me that we suffer with our country, I'm going to characterize that. Okay, it's going to be clear in a second. Okay, so this is the spending, the optimal spending rule. So I show you the incentive compatible allocation, then I'm going to show you the optimal spending rule, which is basically you choose a threshold for theta, for theta, over which everyone below has discretion, everyone above doesn't have discretion. You can see a complicated formula in here. I don't know if I'm going to have time to explain it, but there is a term here that doesn't depend on the assets. And there is a big term in here that depends on the assets and it depends on the presence of default risk. You see, there is this derivative of the interest rate respect to the bunching threshold. If this is 0, this is basically what happens in Amador, Aguiar, and Burning. The optimal threshold solves this simple equation. It's super simple. And even in this complicated model, you can solve the threshold. And this basically says, look, if the beta goes to 1, you allow for full discretion. That means the threshold goes to the upper bar. Everyone is free to do whatever they want. If beta goes to 0, there is no discretion whatsoever. You bunch all the guys, you say nobody can choose freely. I, the planner, decide what is the spending, and I don't care what you want to say, you do it, okay? Then when there is default risk, there is some terms, and some of them you can see it in Halak and Yaret in the AER paper. They are different. They are different because in Halak and Yaret it's about a market clearing condition. Here it's about the risk premium. It's the effect of the default threshold in the risk premium. It has a different feature. So just to quickly go through this is all present in the previous literature. So what is the optimal if the friction is severe, so beta is sufficiently low, you allow no discretion. Basically, no government can use any argument to change the deficit, the planner decided. If the friction is large enough, but there is no default risk, then you have this simple threshold that literally is exactly the same as in Amador, Burning, and Angeletos. Oh, be careful that this doesn't mean a constant threshold independent of A doesn't mean that the deficit is independent of A. The deficit limit will be this G or a version of that. And basically what you're going to have is that when you approach the default area, the upper bound, the deficit limit is tightening, okay? And then when you enter in the default area, the default risk starts to kick in. And here, as opposed to Halak and Yaret, we can point out this because in their case, it doesn't depend, the optimal spending rule doesn't depend on that. What happens is like, you not only start to tighten the maximum consumption, you start to cut on discretion. That is gonna look like even tighter, steeper cut in the deficit limit. Basically, you say, oh, 1% now, if there is default risk, you say 0% deficit. So in such a way that the discretion is reduced to a minimum, okay? Now, given that I have like 1 minute or 2 minutes, let me give you an example. This is what I call Argentina. I'm gonna try to go quickly through this. So this is what I call Argentina. Suppose beta is equal to 0, it's a case that is easier to characterize. Right, when beta is equal to 0, as I told you, there is no, you don't allow any discretion in the economy. You say, I think this is Argentina, honestly. So you say to the government, there is no discretion, you cannot make any argument, the deficit is 0, and you follow it. If you allow, the planner may allow for some deficits if the interest rate is low. If that happens, you're gonna have a dead limit. And the dead limit is gonna coincide exactly with what the government will choose. So in this case, if you impose the right spending rule, the government follows the optimal optimal default rule, the optimal choice. So this happens when either there is autarky, when the exclusion is permanent, or when the exclusion you return immediately. When there is a possibility that you can return to the markets, in this case, so what happens is that the government wants to impose a tighter borrowing limit. Let me show you in a figure here. So this will be what I think is the case for Argentina. This is what the government in Argentina would like to do, conditional on the optimal rule. So it will choose endogenously a dead limit, but the planner would like to make it tighter. And the reason why the planner makes it tighter is interesting. It's not because it's thinking that the government is spending too much. It's because it's thinking that the government is defaulting too little. Basically because you have a return probability. So you are the government. For you, if you default, you know, I could come back to the markets in the future. By giving the discount that option, I don't internalize the benefit of returning for the future types. So the government the planner says, okay, you default, and then eventually the economy is going to come back, and then the future types are going to benefit from a very low levels of debt. And I thought it was interesting because it's sort of counterintuitive here. The problem is that the governments don't really fully internalize the benefits of defaulting when this possibility of returning, okay? And this is basically the optimal rule. So I don't think I started 3 minutes late, right? Or more. Well,
yes, Facundo, you can have 2 more minutes.
Okay, so I just finished it. So what happens in here is when beta is positive and there is permanent exclusion, under some conditions, again, you have a borrowing limit, okay? But when beta is sufficiently large and there is some savers, and here it's very important that it has to be savers in the economy. So if there are no savers, suppose because the interest rate is low or because the distribution of types is sufficiently bad, so you always put a borrowing limit. And the borrowing limit is not like you cannot pass it. It says if you pass it, you have to default. Okay, thinking about Maastricht, if you say 60%, if you think this is a theory of borrowing limit, if you say it should be 60% of GDP, the rule should say if you have more than 60, you have to default. That would be the optimum. Okay, and in this case, this is the case that I show you. When there are savers, you have default in equilibrium, and the equilibrium will look exactly as I showed you at the beginning. Okay, so basically you ban default up to a certain level, and then you allow full discretion for default. Okay, so quick thing. Suspension of payments. As I said, here we are allowing the types to return with 0 assets, but in real life there are haircuts, and then you return with some assets. In particular, you may think there are only suspension of payments in the sense that this is an extreme case that is very useful. So suppose you can return, but there is no debt forgiveness. Basically, when you return, you have to pay exactly the same debt that you borrowed before. So you default in $100. When you come back to the market, you have to default. You have to pay back those $100. Of course, if you are the guy who defaulted, you are never going to come back to the market. So who is going to come back? Somebody, when you have a theta low guy that wants to pay the debt, is going to come back and the economy is going to return. But that looks exactly the same as a permanent exclusion. It's exactly the same as a permanent exclusion, and it's basically this proposition 4. So here, when you have suspension of payments, it's like permanent exclusion, and you either have a borrowing limit, tight borrowing limit, or an area with band default, and then discretion after that. So to conclude, I think I'm almost on time. We need to do, as I said, this is the very first presentation and first draft, no draft even. So we need to do the combination in which beta is bigger than 0, and there is some possibility of returning to the market, and also to see the effects of the different haircuts on the rules. Okay, but just to make it simple, what is the takeaway? In these economies with default, you need not only deficit limits, you need sometimes borrowing limits, or you need debt limits, and also default rules. You need to say sometimes you are forced to default, and sometimes you have to say you are not allowed to default even if you want. Okay, and that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Facundo. It was very, very interesting. I will open the floor to the audience if there are questions. So, if there are no questions, I will make just a more methodological point.
Yes.
Maybe you can explain very quickly why you choose to have the continuous time setting instead of the discrete time for this type of question.
Okay, let me come back to that. And this is important. So this is the idea. So when you have in discrete time, where you're choosing that, you're moving that, you think about, okay, now let me put it in this equation. When you are in the non-default area in discrete time and you're choosing that, you have to consider that when you're moving the debt, it's like you have jumps. You have to compare the situation if you choose a debt that implies default and a debt that doesn't imply default, and how the changes on the assets affect the default risk also. By choosing the debt levels, you are affecting the default risk. And that makes this problem super complicated in discrete time. When you have continuous time, in every instance, your epsilon accumulation of debt doesn't affect the default risk. It doesn't change. The default risk, the change in default risk is embodied in the value function, but you personally, you act like you cannot affect it. And then basically the first order conditions become extremely simpler compared to the default. Whoever has worked in the default literature knows these problems with the price manipulation that in this case disappear, right? I don't know if I answer your question.
Yeah, I think you did. Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Are there
Another
other
question?
questions from people from the
Yeah,
audience?
so
Pablo.
yeah,
yes.
I have a question. Yes, maybe kind of returning a little bit about this implementation and the fiscal rules.
Yes.
It's because it seems, is there a mapping between like a spending rule and a default rule that will leave this principal equally, like with the same level of utility, or like or you bring it at the same frontier, in the sense that the implementation of a fiscal rule, like as you said, seems to be easier than saying, look, you can run a deficit only of 2% of GDP or 3% of
Yes.
GDP, but forcing a government of not defaulting when in fact it would be optimal for the guy who is in power to default seems harder, like if you think about like the real world. So I was wondering whether is this is there a mapping between the two, or that's something that there's no. Yeah, that's a question.
Oh, you say replacing this, replacing the non-default the non-default bank with another rule.
Yes,
Something like that?
with something that is like a spending rule, and I
Exactly.
say,
So
okay,
you
when
can-
the impatient guy comes.
Yes. So what you can, so basically what it's going to look, if you think about that, maybe I don't have a graphical representation, but think about this when you are entering this area in which the government wants to default. Even if you ban default, you are approaching the default area, right? So consumption is going to start to, in the optimal, is going to start to sharply fall, right? So it's going to start to fall down. So basically you can write maybe like deficit limits that are going to be even more stricter, contingent on the debt level. Is that something like that what you have in mind? That you say,
Yes,
look,
yes, something like that. So, but I feel like it would be, so the mapping to the real world in some sense is. I feel like if you have a plan, if you write rules that depend on spending, seems to be, as opposed to forcing government not to default, that seems to be a little bit more realistic, in terms of the implementation.
No, but look, I don't know what is realistic. The fact that you have seen in real life that limits doesn't mean that it's more realistic. That is the idea what they came with. They never thought, I don't know if they ever thought about putting a banner rule or an enforced rule. I don't know if it's less or more realistic. You can write in the Constitution that a country is not allowed to default, right? Why not? So, and the government
yes, but
you haven't seen it. I agree you haven't seen it, but that doesn't mean that you cannot do it.
Yeah. No, but I guess given that we observe these fiscal rules more than these default rules, even if you think about, so forget about being realistic or non-realistic, but like as a way to motivate. So let's say the optimal thing to do would be to kind of move from a world with no commitment to a world where in certain states we can impose commitment. That's how I see these default rules. So like right now, we wrote an environment with no commitment. Now, somehow we can put it in the Constitution that now we are a country where like for certain the levels we are committed to repay. But then we see that in most cases the rules are written depend on expenditures.
Yes.
So I would say this mapping might be useful even from that point of view, saying, look, what we are trying to attain is something where we can impose a default rule that would be optimal. Maybe we can implement that allocation with a fiscal rule that only constrains expenditures. So even if from a theoretical point of view, or like a way to link to what we see, I think the exercise might be useful. I would
Okay, so let me give you an example and let me see if that makes you a bit more happy, right? Suppose you write in the rule, there is a big rule with supermajority that says, whenever you have a debt that is supposed less than 20% of GDP, the budget should be first allocated to pay debt, no matter what. Will that be better? You say you first pay debt and And then if you don't have enough money, you cut on other things. That will be in the line, but I don't know. We can talk later, but I think that will be in the
Yes,
line.
yes, yes. I think we can, yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, I think it's just worth maybe thinking about these fiscal rules and how they interact with these default
Yes.
rules.